Hello and welcome to the Federal. I'm Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay, and you're watching our program Off the Beaten Track. In this program, we do not talk about just the headline of the day, but we go behind those issues which actually go up to making the headline. Now, everybody knows that whenever we have elections in this country, and it always is happening, either it has just happened or is going to happen over the next few months or maybe weeks. So whenever elections are talked, various vote bank, this jargon comes up. So one of the biggest vote banks in India is considered to be the Muslim vote bank. Now the question is that are Muslims in India a homogeneous community? Do all Muslims exhibit the same political behavior? Do they all vote for the same party? There are many who actually believe this, especially those who want to disparage the Muslim community, and also those parties which have traditionally attracted the support, the electoral support of the Muslims. But maybe this is not really a reality. Maybe the Muslim community in India is as heterogeneous as the other communities are, most importantly, the Hindus. Maybe it has some kind of a influence from Hindu society in Islam in India. So we will talk about these very fundamental but also intensely complex issues. My guest today is the eminent sociologist who is also a professor at the Aziz Premji University, Khalid Anis Ansari. So welcome to this program, Khalid Bhai, if I may take the liberty of calling you Khalid Bhai. You can also use my first name instead of a Mr. Let's start with trying to understand a basic primer. I have given an introduction that maybe the Muslims are not as homogeneous as is understood by most people, including our viewers. Let's start by debunking this, that it is actually socially as well as politically a heterogeneous community which does not exhibit a synchronized political and social behavior. Let's try to understand from it.
Thank you, Nilanjan, for having me here. So yeah, like you've said, so Muslims are not really, like any community, they are not monolithic. There are internal cultural diversities, there are internal hegemonies, and now we need to talk about that. So in terms of caste, there are Savarn Muslims, Ashraf Muslims, which club the immigrant Muslims, the Persians, the Abyssinians, the Arabs, and so on and so forth.
The so-called invaders in the popular political.
Yeah, not only invaders, they also came as merchants, they also came as Sufis, Islamic missionaries. So again, this notion of invaders is slightly misplaced.
No, I'm actually using the phrase of the popular dominant political ideology of the country, that is the majoritarian Hindutva ideology. That is how they want to look at every Muslim who's their ancestors actually came from outside India, geographical India.
Yeah. So those Muslims who immigrated from West Asia, from Afghanistan, from Abyssinia, they're also not a monolithic group. So while they form a class of so-called outsiders, but still, in terms of occupation, in terms of their power, they're also a very differentiated group. So they are merchants, they're intellectuals, they're laboring classes, artisans, which also immigrated from outside.
Right.
So that is the first class, the immigrants and the local upper caste Hindu converts. So, for example, Gaud Brahmins in West UP, the Tyagi Brahmins, and the Rajput Hindus who converted to Islam. So those converts, indigenous upper caste converts and immigrant Muslims, they form what is now characterized as the Ashraf Muslims, the high caste, upper caste Muslims. Then once we go a bit deeper, then there are the backward Muslims, Shudra Muslims. There are Dalit Muslims who converted from erstwhile untouchable caste. There are Adivasi Muslims, like the One Gujars, the Bhil Muslims, the Gond Muslims, and Muslims in Lakshadweep, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So these three categories, the backward Muslims, Shudra Muslims, the Dalit Muslims, and Adivasi Muslims, are what are now characterized as the Pasmanda Muslims.
Right.
And they constitute about 85% of the Indian Muslim population.
Of the Muslim community.
Yeah.
So, which means that, the Bahujan idea, which was created by Kanshiram within the Hindu society, when he actually floated the idea of the Bahujan Samaj Party, that there is a Bahujan, which is actually not the dominant Brahmin or the upper caste. It is actually the Bahujan. So even within the Muslim society of India, you have actually a Bahujan, which is actually the non-Ashraf. We get the labels of Aljaf and Arzal. That is, those are the two titles that one actually gets. And we talk about the Pasmanda Muslims in a broad sense, word of the use of the word. There's something very intriguing that I have always, not really been able to unravel. Political conflict in India started becoming a dominant issue in Indian political and electoral politics from the mid-1980s onwards, essentially with the emergence of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, really as a dominant issue. Communalism, of course, has always been an issue. It's been the basis of partition of the British India or the Indian subcontinent. But as a dominant issue in elections, in everyday politics, really started coming up. Having reported also in the 1980s and the early 90s, I would say that the word Pasmanda, or the Pasmanda, whatever is the right pronunciation, came in much later. We were introduced to this new word only sometime in the 1990s, at the time when possibly Narasimha Rao's government was on its way out, and the most turbulent period of coalition politics was beginning to emerge in India. What is the reason behind this? That this basic contradiction within Muslim society in India never really came to the fore outside the community.
Yes, so so the experience of caste discrimination within Muslims has always been there. Right. In the medieval period, in the modern period, in the contemporary period, and so on and so forth. And the experience has been categorized through different labels. So, for example, in the pre-partition, pre-independence period, so there was this organization called the Moment Conference, which used the term moment, the appellation moment, to characterize and to capture the experience of lower caste Muslims. That was pre-partition. From 90s onward, which is the Mandal period, against the caste question is opened because of the Lohiite and the Dalit influence, Kashiram, and it also has a certain purchase within the lower caste Muslims. And the term Pasmanda is articulated in 1998 by Ali Anwar, who is the founding leader of the All India Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz. So the experience has always been there.
He was also a legislator with the Rashtriya Janata Dal, and politically active, has been a member of parliament and also active in politics for a long time.
Absolutely. So the experience has been there. And if you look at Bulle Shah, so Bulle Shah is a Sayyid, someone very popular saint, and so he has these songs where he is being made fun, mocked by his sister, because Bulle Shah, being a Sayyid, was a follower of a lower caste Muslim saint. His guru, his ustad, was a lower caste Muslim from a Rain community, and Rain are Muslim vegetable growers and so on and so forth. If you look at Kabir uses the word Turk to refer to the immigrant Muslims, and for the native Muslims, he would use their caste titles, Julaha, and so on and so forth. So
Kabir himself was from the Weaver
from the Julaha community, from the Julaha Muslim community. Yeah. So the experience has always been there, but it has been articulated differently in different space and time contexts. So Pasmanda is the recent articulation in the 1990s.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean resistance to upper caste domination was not there, or resistance to power was not there. So there is a limitation of official archive, but in the popular memory, in folklore, so it is there. I mean, this experience of the marginalization and discrimination, atrocities against lower caste Muslims. So it is there, but it is not there in the official archive in a very explicit way.
We all know, I'm just straying a bit from the central point that we're talking about. I'm also trying to understand as to why this consciousness did not exist. Uh, from 1909, we had a separate electorate of Muslims in India. Till 1947, after that, independent India decided that there is not going to be any separate electorate for Muslims. But universal suffrage came to India only after independence. Now, from 1909 to 1947, in every elections, only a very small fraction of the Muslim community would have had voting rights. I can presume, I'm asking you as a question, can I presume that those who had the voting rights were actually nothing but really the dominant Ashraf group? And that is why, in the post-independence period, at least for the first 2 or 2.5 decades, we notice as a natural sense that this is my entitlement of the elite class among the Muslims to be active in politics. And likewise, the backward Muslims would think that this is something which is not really open to us, and that is why it's only much later that articulation for political equality starts getting articulated by the Pasmanda Muslims. Am I correct in understanding?
Yeah, broadly, I'm with you. I mean, your articulation, but I will take it a bit,
Yes, definitely.
deeper in history. So, I mean, so there is this Orientalist colonial intervention from at least 1780s to 1820s, when systematized knowledge about India and the way India is mapped through the religious prism, right? So Hindu-Muslim differences, they become essentialized during this period, and religion becomes a prime category for mapping India, which is very different from the earlier imagination, where the Indian identity was much more fuzzier, and there was much more influence of caste, region, language, and so on and so forth in articulating identities. So after the Orientalist colonial intervention, things changed, and Hindu and Muslim, and particularly their difference and also their antagonism, it was reified, it was objectivized in a particular way, and that has influence on in the early struggles during the freedom struggle, and also till today in the post-colonial period also, in the way identities are imagined, in the way policy is scripted, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the period that you talk about, so 1909 is Morley Minto reforms. For the first time, separate electorate is articulated. And even if you go 30 years back, so there is the Hunter's report in 1880s, Hunter Education Report,
right,
where he uses the data of Bengal, where the Muslims are extremely backward, and extrapolates that to the entire Muslim identity. While at the same time, in United Provinces, the Muslims were extremely privileged. They had a very high percentage of representation in government services, in colonial services. So United Provinces, their population was around, say, 12 to 14% or so, maybe a bit higher. But in government services in 1861, the representation is 60%, right? Even in 1931, their percentage is around 30%. In the government police services in 1947, their percentage is around 30-40%. I mean, I don't recall the exact numbers, but they are extremely
quite a revelation.
Extremely overrepresented. And when we disaggregate the data of Muslim population in the colonial period, then obviously out of 20%, 14% Muslims, those who are able to corner the government services, they are usually the Ashraf elite Muslims because of their cultural capital. So they are not only
also access to education.
Yeah, access to education. So they are 5 or 6 or 7 times more represented than their actual numbers. So this is not a story of marginalization. It is a story of privilege. And Hunter creates this notion of entire Muslim community as backward community, which the myth is still sustaining till this day.
Yeah, within the Hindu community also this was the same, that the Brahmins and the upper caste were the dominant one, both in terms of having positions at various government services, or even now, we have across various professions, we have a lot, essentially an upper caste domination. We still see even within our own media, the media, you have actually very little representation from really the lower caste among the Hindus. Essentially, it still remains an upper caste dominated profession.
Yeah.
So, there is something which I'm trying to. I was reading one of your recent, research papers where you have written, and you talk about the Pasmanda discourse. You use the phrase emphasizes internal heterogeneity, heterogeneities and hegemonies and pluralizes the Muslim. Now, in very simple terms, how does one actually explain that? What does the Pasmanda discourse do by the introduction of the Pasmanda?
Yeah, so connecting to our earlier discussion,
Yes.
so this notion of the hegemony of the politicized religion, whether the Hindu community or the Muslim category, so what it does, it hides more than it reveals. So there are a number of experiences of marginalized Muslims which get absolutely erased. And I see the anti-caste movement within Muslims to push back this invisibilization of the experience of marginalized Muslim caste, gender, LGBTQI Muslims, different regional Muslims, the Bengali Muslims, the Kashmiri Muslims, the Manipuri Muslims, the Lakshadweep Muslims, the Malabar Muslims, so on and so forth, even in terms of linguistic groups. So this notion of Muslim as an overarching category, this has to be interrogated. And Paswanta movement, using the caste lens, it is trying to interrogate that, but it is not only bringing caste on board. Once this Muslim as a category is interrogated, it is hyphenated, then more stories of marginalized Muslims will come to the table. And that will pluralize the notion of Muslim identity. It will bring in a multiplicity of voices, which are in the normal course of time, they are not even registered or acknowledged. For example, let us talk about, just as an instance, let us talk about Lakshadweep, right? So right. Lakshadweep, the story is there are tribal Muslims, there is one ST seat, MP seat, which is reserved and so on and so forth. But if you talk to Lakshadweep Muslims, they would have a story of they will see the Kerala Muslims, particularly the Koya Muslims, as a settler colonial identity. They will see Malayalam as a hegemonic language, which is being imposed on them. Mm-hmm. So they have it's a very different story there. And these kinds of stories will never find voice in mainstream media, in mainstream academia. Right. So I see the caste movement as a pushback to this domination of the Muslim category and diversifying and pluralizing the Muslim space by bringing in a number of other voices, which will not, in the course of, in the normal course, will even get official recognition and attention.
There is one particular dilemma which I have faced as a journalist, over 4 decades. Primarily, this is the 4 decades where actually one saw gradual increased marginalization and targeting of the Muslim community as a composite whole. That is something which is happening, and it is now the dominant political ideology of the country, the majoritarian ideology, which is the official, officially given the name of the Hindutva politics, which is there. And we have seen a steady rise in the support of, Hindutva right through the mid-1980s onwards. Now, in this particular situation where just because of the religious identity that people are being targeted, the articulation of caste and an anti-caste sentiment or any kind of attempt to resolve the internal caste contradictions within the community appears to be a bit self-defeating. Obviously, this may not be the actual situation. I would like to hear from you that how does one actually walk through this dilemma? That is it important for secular groups in India to talk about the elitism of a small fraction within the Muslim community, or does one actually talk about the targeting of the entire community?
So that is the entire issue. How do we understand the communal or conservative or right-wing discourses in Hindus and Muslims?
Right.
And because communal violence is extra-legal violence.
That's right.
Why do certain sections resort to communal violence? I think that is the key question, and that is where we need to fix our lens on, our gaze on. So in the normal course of time, Hindu society is extremely divided in terms of caste, in terms of sex, and so on and so forth. Also, the Muslim society is very divided, and we talked about those divisions.
Yes.
And Dr. Ambedkar, in one of his writings, he says that it is only during the time of a riot when Hindus are united. So what Dr. Ambedkar says about the Hindu society is also true about the Muslim society. It is only during the time of riot when Muslims and Hindus as unified communities are reproduced. They are produced. So communal violence is not a spontaneous violence. It is orchestrated violence, and the elite Hindus and Muslims, they benefit from it. And this Hindu-Muslim violence, Hindu-Muslim binary, what it does is it actually displaces the social justice aspirations of pan-religion, lower caste, marginalized sections within both the communities. So in that sense, you are right that this discourse, it shrinks the space for social justice talk of Pasmanda or even Hindu lower caste or Adivasis and so on and so forth. And that is why the Hindu-Muslim binary, it is one of the foremost binary that the Bahujans are trying to displace. They're struggling with it. Because unless the Hindu-Muslim binary is parochialized, their voices will not achieve center stage. They won't be included in the deliberation process in policy and so on and so forth. So I think that is the master binary, which all the lower caste, pan-religion lower caste groups, they are struggling with.
Now, I have a question actually, once again, stemming from my experience as a journalist, right from the 1980s, you talk about communal riots being the only times when the Hindus are united and also the Muslims get united. The religion-based social identity becomes stronger and more cohesive only during riots. In the 1980s, we had fewer riots. You can actually start counting on fingers. But what happens is that gradually from the 1990s onwards, communal violence or communal prejudice against one another changes character. It is not just a riot after riot. That is not the only time when the prejudice is articulated against the other community, that is the Muslim. We now talk about it actually being a permanent phenomenon. We have a Deputy Chief Minister of Maharashtra, Devendra Fadnavis, actually using the word Aurangzeb Aulad. So there is always in the vocabulary, there is a constant of the prejudice towards the Muslim. In a situation like that, does it not become more difficult for the the lower caste, the Bahujan groups to be able to give a pushback against caste domination by the elites in both Hindus and Muslims, especially Muslims?
Yeah, so in the post-1990s period, there is also the embrace of neoliberal economic reforms.
That's right.
And Indian economy is going through a massive crisis, and there is almost a policy turn. And neoliberal capitalist economics, it has uneven consequences. It is very differentiated and so on and so forth. So it is not only that upper caste have gained and lower caste. There's a lot of things happening. For example, in certain landed castes, like the Pathans, the Rajputs, there are stories of downward mobility. So those who were privileged earlier, they are facing downward mobility, and they are filled with a certain kind of a rage. And this rage can be weaponized by those who play the Hindu-Muslim politics. In Dalits, in Bahujans, in Pasmandas, because of reservations, because of the changing economic opportunity structure, there is also an upward mobility. So there is an emergence of a middle class within the lower caste groups also, which might not necessarily represent or represent or work for the interests of the 85% of the Bahujans, which are largely unorganized sector laborers, peasants, artisans, and so on and so forth. But it might also be influenced by creating some kind of space by integrating in the neoliberal consumerist fantasy, right? So there are all kinds of moves, all kinds of disruptions in the social happening in the 1990s period. And these disruptions are being managed by the elite classes through what you say, through an intensifying communal discourse, through an intensifying reading of history, through the Hindu-Muslim lens. And it is very colonial orientalist in nature. And all this talk of decolonization by the Hindu right, it is actually not decolonization. They are not going deep enough in decolonizing because they are actually re-strengthening the colonial orientalist Hindu-Muslim dichotomy. So it becomes very difficult for lower caste sections to really see that their voices are heard, that they are part of the democratic process. But still, they try. So they mobilize their counter mobilizations against the elite-led communal mobilizations. So that contest is there. Obviously, the elite sections with their resources, with their control over academia, think tanks, the communicative and propaganda apparatus. So they have an edge there. But still, the marginalized class, they also try. They also create their own counter publics, their own little magazines, their own YouTube channels, and they constantly contest these narratives. Sometimes successfully, most of the times not. But that is how power works.
Well, I think it's very important what you are pointing out. Moving towards the concluding part of our discussion, that is, we have to also bring and try to contextualize everything within what is actually called practical or day-to-day real politics. We have here the dominant political party of the country, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which actually pursues a very majoritarian politics. It's, the ideology is Hindutva, which is actually, total Hindu, cultural nationalism is something that they project, Now, in the last several years, especially from last year onwards, the BJP leadership, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, specifically from the National Executive Meeting in Hyderabad in July last year, repeatedly been giving the call that the BJP must also reach out to the Muslims, especially the poorer sections. When he says poorer sections, as our discussion shows, they are also the Bahujan Samaj within the Muslims. Even after 2019, Mr. Modi had talked about that Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas has happened. Now we have to actually seek Sabka Vishwas, which means that the intention is articulated. But actually, one has seen as a journalist that the intention is actually, there is a deficit in terms of the deed of the political party. A very simple question. Does the BJP have any possibility of getting the support of significant or even a very small group of Muslim support, barring what has been there and been established by institutes like like the CSDS, which has actually found that there has been a 5 to 10% or maybe 11-12% support from within the Muslim community for the BJP in different elections.
Yeah, so I mean, Prime Minister Modi, he articulated he gave legitimacy to the term Pasmanda, not only recently, but even in the 2017 Odisha conclave.
That's right.
So there has been an engagement with Pasmanda question for quite some time in the RSS BJP circles. And it's only in the recent Hyderabad conclave when it was covered and given articulated, and it became a part of the attention economy. Everyone is talking about the term Pasmanda now. So it's been circulating in academic and activist and also popular media spheres. So yeah, BJP is a professional party, just like any other party.
Right.
And in a first past the post, they need numbers to win elections. And the opposition, they are very clear. The opposition works with the Muslim elite organizations,
right,
Muslim elite groups.
They continue to do so according to you.
They continue to do so. Our Congress, RJD, BSP, they shy away from using the Pasmanda category. They don't take the concerns of 85% of Pasmanda Muslims seriously at all. So they are basically catering, even the Dalit Muslim articulation. It is Dalit Ashraf articulation for all practical purposes. So now BJP and they have moved. And they're trying, it's not only the Pasmanda that they're trying to woo. If you look at non-Jatav constituencies, non-Yadav constituencies, non-Ashraf Muslims, so whatever is the strength of the opposition and their weakness, so they're entering into the weakness of the opposition. Whatever the opposition cannot include, whatever the opposition is excluding, whichever communities, the BJP is trying to integrate them symbolically, in a tokenistic manner. But in a first past the post, I mean, there are all kinds of negotiations that happen. So even the violence against Muslims, their oppression, discrimination against Pasmanda Muslims, it is felt differentially by different sections. Even the Pasmanda is not a monolithic field. There are around 705 lower caste Muslims. So if there is lynching against the Qureshis, not all Pasmanda Muslims are affected in the same way through lynching, right? And because of the economic policies, subsidies, and so on and so forth, so different sections would face differential impact.
Right.
So weavers have a different problem. The Dhuniyas, the cotton carders have a different problem. The Qureshis have a different problem. And there is, like I said, there is an upwardly aspirational class, even within Pasmanda Muslims,
Right.
that thinks beyond ideology, that is more interested in their own personal ambitions, getting integrated into the power. And for them, it hardly matters whether it is Congress which is giving them space, or BJP which is giving them space, or BSP which is giving them space. They are very Catholic in terms of the power. In terms of power, if BJP gives them space, they'll move there. So I think that is what we need to understand, that in UP, for example, or in Bihar, in a closely contested elections, wherein 80 or 90 seats, a margin of 5,000 votes, 2,000 votes, it can make a difference. So right now, BJP's Muslim share was around 8%, according to CSDS data.
Right.
So Muslim vote, BJP won't get the majority of Muslim votes. But if it is able to increase this 8% share to 20% share, the opposition will be absolutely vanquished.
Right. Maybe 20, even if it is not 20%, that is actually totally vanquished, but yes, the BJP might become much more competitive in a,
absolutely.
Even
absolutely.
if it is 11%, 12% or 13%.
Yeah.
You raised, you made a mention which actually triggered a memory in my mind. You talked about the Qureshis, that's how it came up. Now, normally, from what I understand, Qureshis are actually the caste which is considered to be involved with the meat trade.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the attack on Muslims is also very selective, because what is more visibly Muslims? The Julaha is not visibly a Muslim, but the meat dealer or the meat trader is actually visibly a Muslim. It actually is a stereotype that the Muslims eat meat, they eat, beef, and that they are the ones who get targeted most. It's also the fact you were talking about economic liberalization. We know that meat exports in India have actually grown tremendously from the mid-19th onwards. In fact, Gujarat, very paradoxically, has been one of the biggest so-called beef exporters, because even Kara beef, that is buffalo, is also categorized as beef. Despite the fact, that being the fact, the point is that when the targeting is done, either during communal riots or during the non-riot period, which is the period when Aurangzeb ka aulad comes out, the visible Aurangzeb ka aulad is actually the Qureshi. So possibly the angst will be much more selective within the Muslims. Is that true? So?
Yeah. So I mean, there is a political economy dimension, like you said.
Yes.
The beef export, and that sector is dominated by businessmen who are very close to the Hindu right? Very close to the BJP RSS apparatus. Right. So this attack on beef and local beef producers, especially the Qureshis, there is not only a communal dimension, there is also a political economic dimension.
Right.
And you brought in the question of Aurangzeb. So during Aurangzeb's regime, the Marathas and the Rajputs, their representation in Mansabdari was the highest. Right. So again, one has to rethink. So Aurangzeb in that regime. So I mean, so history, if you read through the Hindu-Muslim lens, you reach up to a particular conclusions. But it is much more complicated than that. So yes, Qureshis, obviously, because of a certain imagination of Muslims as meat eating, and Qureshis doing that business, they being in the butchering and meat business. So in order to monopolize this market, they had to be displaced. And one of the reasons of this lynching and this violence is also to displace the Qureshis from the meat industry, so that the big business could move in and use that site as for export and so on and so forth. So you see, there are two, communist discourse forms the ideological backdrop, but actually there is a movement in terms of political economy. Right. Where a section of small scale meat producers, they are being displaced so that the big business is able to monopolize that domain.
Right. So, one of my last questions, in fact, the last but one question, that despite the targeting of Muslims by the dominant political ideology of the day, you think that the Pasmanda movement is going to become stronger in Indian Muslims?
It has become stronger. We are not in the 1990s when it was very nascent. Right. Now there is more discussion, there is more contestation. For example, recently in Andhra Pradesh, there was this meeting in Telangana. There was this meeting by Pasmanda Muslim activists, and they were contesting Owaisi there. So I think it will sediment, it will be circulated more, but one doesn't know. I mean, this is a complex space, and the competition in politics, what kind of logics prevail in the longer run, one is not sure, but one can say with certainty that Pasmanda discourse and the Pasmanda activists, their voices are being heard more. They're getting more space in the attention economy, and so on and so forth. How it pans out in the future, one is not sure. Yeah.
Right. And my final question to you that, yes, we are aware that there has been consistently, even in the last 2 decades, there has been a consistent support for the BJP from among the Muslims. And it is possible that, as we were talking about it, this might increase marginally. Now, do you think that there will be ever any acceptance of those Muslims who are supporting the BJP within the BJP's own dominant social constituency? That is the Hindu. Would they be considered? Would they be considered to be more very specific? Sorry, I interrupted you. Would they be accepted as much Indians as they themselves consider themselves to be?
That's a very complex situation, complex question to answer, because there is a conceptual background.
Right.
And again, it's an Orientalist colonial background where Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, and Buddhists, they're supposed to be Indic religions. Right. And Islam and Christianity are represented in terms of their origins.
In fact, Article 25,
25B. We know 25B. Yeah. So that is a long-standing conceptual blind spot that one needs to take up. For example, I mean, someone like Savarkar, he can be influenced by Italian fascism and German Nazism. Someone like Dr. Ambedkar could be influenced by John Dewey and international thinkers, Marx, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the question of the reservation for Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims, or when it comes to the question, so Dr. Ambedkar, in one of his interventions, he was ready that the Dalits could convert to Buddhism or any other religion, but they should not convert to Islam or Christianity, because in that case, they would be denationalized.
Right.
Now, when Dr. Ambedkar uses the word denationalization for Dalits converting to Islam and Christianity, so there is an assumption that Islam and Christianity are not within the national imagination. Right. And this is a long-standing, right from writings of William Jones in 1780s, where he introduces this distinction between Pitra Bhumi and Punya Bhumi. That distinction is also embraced by someone like Savarkar and also Dr. Ambedkar.
And the entire RSS.
Yeah, entire RSS. And that is also inbuilt into the constitution, right? So we have to rethink some of these trajectories. And this is now the right time, because unless we rethink these blind spots, we can't have a robust democracy. We'll be a very divisive society, a very unfree and a very unequal society.
Having a robust democracy is really indeed one of the biggest challenges in front of India and the Indians today. Thank you, Dr. Khalid Anis Ansari, for this wonderful discussion, which I'm sure that in several times to come, this is going to be a major reference discussion, in trying to understand an issue which is very fundamental to Muslim society in India, but very rarely gets talked about. And once again, thank you very much for coming and really explaining it in very layman's terms to the ordinary viewer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nilanjan sir.
Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more news and updates.